All right. Okay. So, hello, everyone. My name is Anna Berg. I'm one of the co-organizers of the conference, The Great Mediation. And on behalf of the organizers team, I welcome you to this session. For our first keynote, we are delighted to welcome Professor Francesca Polletta. She's a professor of sociology at the University of California, Irvine, and works in the areas of culture, politics, social movements, and law. Much of her work investigates culture understood less as beliefs and worldviews than as familiar relationships, institutional routines, and conventions of self-expression. She is the author of the award-winning book Freedom is an Endless Meeting, Democracy in American Social Movements, and the award-winning book It Was Like a Fever, Storytelling in Protest and Politics. Her new book just came out last year, entitled Inventing the Ties That Bind, Imagined Relationships in Moral and Political Life, in which she explores how Americans think about what they owe to others and how, on the basis of these diverse relationships, there emerge possibilities for building a more inclusive politics. So welcome, Francesca Polletta. So before we go to Francesca Polletta's talk, let me briefly say a word about the structure of this webinar. So we're going to be listening to Professor Polletta's talk, and after her talk, we are going to be joined for conversation by a group of the participants in this conference who either have presented or will present their ongoing work in one of the panels today and tomorrow. But we are also excited to hear questions from the audience. So unfortunately, in this webinar format, the general audience cannot join the conversation with cameras on, but please write your questions in the chat using this little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I will read your questions out to Francesca Polletta and our group of panelists. Okay, so without further delay, we are excited to hear Francesca Polletta, who is going to talk to us about social imaginaries in online right-wing populism. Her talk is entitled Intimacy and Conspiracy, Social Imaginaries in Digitally Mediated Right-Wing Populism. Professor Polletta, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much to the organizers of this conference, Nicola, Nissard, and Anna, and thank you to the marvelous panelists and commentators that we've already heard from this morning. I feel simultaneously like I've learned a tremendous amount and I have more questions than when I began, which I think is the sign of the very best conferences. So thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Oops. I want to begin this talk with what has become a kind of conventional wisdom, which is that social media is to blame, at least in part, for the rise of right-wing populism. You've probably heard parts of this argument. I actually believed it myself, but the argument in short is that the algorithmic personalization of the social media platforms we use, the fact that we see the same kinds of material and increasingly extremist material leads to filter bubbles, in which people kind of go down a rabbit hole of extremist thought. At the same time, populist leaders, were often told, have a direct relationship with their followers. They are free of journalistic gatekeepers. And so the combination of those two trends leads social media users to be drawn to political right-wing extremes. And so we have the Donald Trumps and the Modis and the Bolsonaros, et cetera. But in fact, this conventional wisdom actually rests on really shaky evidence. First, and I'm sure Chris Bale will talk about this more tomorrow, there is no clear evidence that algorithmic personalization leads to filter bubbles. One major study of YouTube found that 1 in 100,000 users moved from less to more radical content. And in fact, the demand for radical content was being driven almost exclusively by new users. Same was true in a study of Facebook, Whatever ideological segregation there was being driven by users. And a recent British study found that people who use search engines for news on average are exposed to more news sources and competing sources from left and right than people who do not use search engines. So I don't think that social media are unimportant to the rise and reach of right-wing populism, but rather that we need to think with more sophistication in ways that papers in this conference have already been doing about the elective affinities between social media and right-wing populism. One way of doing so is to ask whether social media have created new imaginaries, new ways of thinking about self and other, power and inequality, truth and subjectivity, and whether those imaginaries have contributed to right-wing populism's reach. And so I'm kind of uncomfortable with the term affordances, because affordances seems to suggest a kind of technological determinism, that they're objective features of social media that lead us to behave in certain ways. And instead, what I want us to think about are the ways in which how we use social media may lead us to new or different understandings of who we are, what our bonds are. People in the earlier sessions referred to political subjectivities, vernaculars of media consumption. Those are the kinds of imaginaries that I'd like to try to unpack. I have to say here to begin with that what I know about right-wing populism and social media comes mainly from the reading that I've been doing in preparation for this talk. I am kind of the opposite of a digital native. I'm the person who got on Facebook early on and then got right off because I was so depressed by how rich everyone else's lives were and how successful and precocious their children were. I don't have an Instagram account. I don't tweet. I think the last video game I played was Pong. But I do work with graduate students who are not only digital natives, but are doing fascinating studies, in particular, of various forms of right-wing populism, both online and off. My student, Nate Redman, for example, is doing an ethnographic and YouTube-based study of disaster preppers who are overlap with, in some ways, a new incarnation of the survivalists of the 1990s. And Colin Bernatsky, whose work I'll draw in directly in this talk, has been doing an ethnographic study of vaccine skeptics and other conspiracy-leaning, increasingly right-wing groups. Now, I should point out right from the start that to call these groups right-wing populist groups or digitally mediated right-wing populist groups is in some ways a problem, right? It's a murky area. And I think we can follow Rogers Brubaker in thinking about populism as a discourse or style in which there is a virtuous people counterposed on one hand to an untrustworthy elite, and on the other to a kind of alien, threatening other. And I'll talk about the ways in which, certainly in the case of the vaccine skeptics, Collins studies, that they've increasingly made common cause with other conspiratorial groups, but also QAnon groups, Trump supporting groups, and they interact both in person, online, and increasingly in anti-lockdown protests. And so I want to propose the following hypothesis. I see it as a claim, but I want to emphasize how tentative it is. And I hope that you will tell me whether it resonates at all with what you've learned and what you've observed. That social media and what we do on social media, namely we share, that those practices have contributed to a social imaginary in which both equality and truth depend on intimacy. And I want to argue that that social imaginary helps to explain two key features of contemporary right-wing populism, especially in its conspiracist version. So one, and I'll talk only very, very briefly about this, why is it that liberty-loving, democracy-supporting, corruption-hating populists nevertheless follow corrupt authoritarian leaders? How do we make sense of these kind of egalitarian leanings with support for authoritarian leaders? And then second, why do populists believe in such implausible theories, such implausible conspiracies? And so to begin to unpack this, I want to begin, as I said, with the practice of online sharing. Sharing is what we do online today. We share links, we share information, we share memories, we share photos, videos. But as the communications scholar Nicholas John points out, and I'll be drawing here on his work, the use of that term in relation to the internet only dates back to about 2005. Before that, sharing in relation to the internet either referred to the common use of a mainframe or disk, or it meant downloading copyrighted material. Beginning in about 2005, though, social media users learned that the purpose of social media was, quote, to connect and share with the people in your life. And here's Mark Zuckerberg in 2012 describing Facebook's original purpose: people sharing more, even if just with their close friends or families, creates a more open culture and leads to a better understanding of the lives and perspectives of others. And so increasingly what we do online came to be seen as sharing. Now, as John points out in his book on the topic, and does so really interestingly, the way in which sharing is usually used actually combines two meanings of the term, two quite different meanings of the term. One, sharing means a kind of self-revelatory communication, right? So we share our feelings with intimates. We share intimacies with those close to us. But sharing also means a kind of communal distribution, right? Sharing your toys. It's more even than a kind of tit for tat reciprocity, equality in that sense, because when you share, you're giving freely without expectation of reciprocation. And so it's a deeply communal relationship. Sharing your feelings is different from sharing your toys, but in part as a result of social media and a discourse that accompanies it, John argues, the two have been conflated. And so we act as if sharing our feelings somehow creates a communal, cooperative relationship, as if sharing our feelings creates equality, solidarity, as if sharing our feelings is equality, as if sharing is sharing. Now, John is interested in how these dual meanings of sharing undergird what's become called as the sharing economy, which ranges from community-based local exchange systems in which people trade power tools and babysitting services to massive corporations, operations like Airbnb and Uber. And the sharing economy is often cast, and certainly at its inception was often cast as this kind of anti-hierarchical, anti-capitalist, cooperative system. And the argument often made in early briefs for the sharing economy was that sharing came naturally to millennials because they were so used to sharing online. Sharing photos, video clips, files, and memes. And so here's a quote from a TED Talk. There were many like this early on. But there's a little reason that sending your photos to friends online, to people you already know, would make you want to lend your things out to people you don't know. It only makes sense because of the conflation, the confusion of the two meanings of sharing. And so the danger that John identifies is that transactions online, not just community exchange systems, but Airbnb, Uber, that transactions online come to have this moral valence as somehow intrinsically egalitarian, honest, authentic, communitarian, simply because they rely on social media. You know, it's interesting, I was looking at clips online for the sharing economy, and every single one of them have a bicycle in them. Right. So again, that it's this very local, intimate kind of exchange. And I think John would argue that that is intimated by the language of sharing. As if talking the way that intimates do, sharing, is the same as equality. I want to argue that we see the same schema in right-wing populism. And I want to try to use this argument to make sense of two questions. One, why do freedom-loving individualists follow authoritarian, corrupt leaders? And I think the point I would just make here is that these leaders don't have an unmediated relationship with their followers. Of course, the relationship is mediated, but they communicate with their followers in a way that seems authentic, idiomatic, often profane, intimate, as if they are one of them. Right? They share a lot. I was thinking of Donald Trump's use of phrases like when he'd spread conspiracy theories, he'd say, some people are saying that, or a lot of people have told me that. I just heard. And in a sense, what he was doing was positioning himself alongside in a relationship of equality with his followers. Sarah Sobierai and Barry have talked similarly about how right-wing outrage media spokespersons, the Sean Hannitys, the Bill O'Reillys, would create intimacy with their followers. And I want to just draw quickly to a fascinating study of a German extreme right group on Facebook studied by Forchter and Culvra. They look at the digital photos that appear on the Facebook page and found that while there are a lot of photos that communicate a sort of traditional authoritarian relationship between followers and leaders, so there are photographs of Nazis, there are photographs of bears, there are kind of traditional, conventional photographs of women with children. They also rely on photographs conveying intimacy. And so there are photos of romantic young couples, of people in nature. And this one, which I find really interesting, it's a picture of Nazis, and you can see that there are kind of little hearts drawn on it. And so followers are, in a sense, invited to share their feelings about leaders. They become something like the winking objects of an adolescent crush. According to the authors, an imaginary of intimacy is especially appealing to young people. And so what I want to suggest here is that this imaginary of intimacy that's made possible in part by what we do online, helps to explain support for authoritarian leaders, not just in the sense that followers believe the leader will take care of us, but also that the leader is one of us. Again, that idea that intimacy implies a kind of equality. But I actually think there's more to this word sharing and to this concept of sharing and to the imaginary it calls up. And that's what I want to talk about in the rest of this talk. And go back to Zuckerberg for a minute. Again, here's his quote: "People sharing more, even if just with their close friends or families, creates a more open culture and leads to a better understanding of the lives and perspectives of others." Now, why would sharing with people you know, or even sharing with people you don't know, create a more open culture? Why would it lead to a more tolerant society in which we understand the perspectives of others? I think because it draws on yet another set of associations. Here, when we use the term sharing, we mean neither that we're sharing intimately, nor that we're sharing our toys in a communal relationship, but we also talk about sharing in the sense of putting it out there, sharing with the world, sharing freely, not sharing with intimates, but sharing with this kind of global world. What's interesting is that sharing in this sense would seem to produce the opposite of tribalism, right? It's the opposite of a close-knit, intimate group. Instead, sharing openly, sharing with the world, putting things out there, would seem to produce cosmopolitanism. But somehow in Zuckerberg's formulation, sharing with just close friends is going to get us to this open world. And so I'm trying to draw attention to this kind of strange world Zuckerberg is imagining, in which an open, boundary-free society will be brought about by close relationships, will be brought about by intimacy. So openness is still made intimate. It's still framed in terms of a communal relationship. And if you look at the clip art about knowledge sharing, right? So this is the third kind of sharing, the third meaning of sharing: boundary spanning knowledge, cosmopolitan, tolerant understanding. If you look at the clip art for this idea of knowledge sharing, you'll see that the photos are almost always of these dyadic couples of two people, right? So it's not like I'm sharing my information with the world. Instead, it's I'm turning on a light bulb in someone else's head. So even though these three meanings of sharing seem quite different, sharing as a self-revelatory kind of communication, sharing as communal exchange, and sharing as boundary-spanning understanding, I'm arguing that they all depend in weird ways on an imagery of intimacy. And I can talk later about how I said this is new to social media since the late 2000s, but in fact, in some ways, this weird combination of cosmopolitanism and tribalism, of cosmopolitanism and intimacy, goes back to the very beginning of internet culture, to Stuart Brand, and I can talk more about that. But what I want to suggest is that this is the imagery that underpins, in certain respects, right-wing populism: a combination of cosmopolitanism and tribalism, of having to find your personal truth in a world of dizzying, incommensurable possibilities, but with your faithful band of intimates. And I would argue that this helps to explain in part why it is that right-wing populists believe such implausible conspiracy theories. And I'm going to talk a little bit about work now by Colin Bernatsky, who, as I said, has been studying for the last few years vaccine skeptics, but also the conspiracy fellow travelers that they increasingly work with. And over time, they've become increasingly right-wing, Trump supporting. They have links with QAnon. And what's important about the work that Colin is doing in this respect is that he's asking how people come to learn conspiracy beliefs, how people come to judge among conspiracy theories. How do people know which ones to believe and which ones not to believe? And what he shows is that this is a profoundly social process. Right? People think in thought communities. And this is as much true of the left wing as it is of the right. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of Colin's findings on how they decide which beliefs to believe and which ones not to believe. Now, these are vaccine skeptics, and so it's probably not surprising that they put a great deal of stock in personal experience. People share a lot of personal stories. Their meetings are a lot of people talking about how their own child was vaccinated and then suffered developmental delays. They often will tell stories that other people have told, sort of, your story is my story, of people experiencing those things. So here's an anti-vaccine organization volunteer talking about how her child had a vaccine reaction. He would react, and the nurse told him, no, you can't get pertussis from the vaccine. And I thought it was weird at the time, but I didn't research. And I show you this quote in part because one of the things that anti-vaccine skeptics do in their personal storytelling a lot is to tell stories of their own personal journey from credulousness to insight. So it's not just these bad things happened to me, or I heard about these bad things happening to people, but this is how I came to put the pieces together and to realize that big pharma was misleading us and that the government was in on it, and possibly that Bill Gates has a depopulation scheme. I think that recounting of my own journey is important because vaccine skeptics are quite convinced that sharing stories isn't enough. They often talk about stories planting the seed. They use that phrase a lot. They're planting the seed. And then you, as the audience for those stories, have to go and do your own research. Right? We talked about this phrase, doing your own research, this morning. We talked about the way it's become a kind of commitment on the part of a number of right-wing populist groups. QAnon, people have written about how QAnon participants talk about collaborative research and standards of proof and evidence, and reject certain theories as being conspiracists. So they're powerfully vested in the idea of their hewing to the norms of an Enlightenment research. But what's striking to me in reading Colin's interviews and observations with anti-vaccine skeptics is that it's hard to do your own research, right? Going down the rabbit hole is challenging. So here's one volunteer saying, I must have read 1,000 websites to get to where I am today. It's hard. If you want to be shown all this, you're going to be passed back and forth, and you're going to change your mind 15 times. And who knows where you land in the end. Thanks to the internet, there is a world of information out there. There are a dizzying array of possibilities. And so right-wing populists believe that they have to reach a truth that is meaningful to them. As one of them put it, you need to find the truth that matches your beliefs and principles, right? But it's hard. Those truth claims out there are incommensurable. And vaccine skeptics often articulate this kind of postmodern view of the world in which there are many truths. How then do you decide which one makes sense to you? And the way that the way vaccine skeptics answer that question is in part by relying on community. How do you know what to believe and what not to believe? You're skeptical of vaccines, but you meet someone who says that the earth is flat, or someone who says that there are aliens, or someone who says that there is, a cabal of Democrat child molesting people out there that Q is combating. It's a challenge to figure out what to believe and not to believe. And one's community is really important in that respect. So here's a vaccine skeptic whom Colin asked how she handled beliefs that were off the beaten track. And she said, well, I'll quite often ask a friend, I'll find out what they've looked at, and then I'll be like, send me your cheat sheets. And so this person's friend did that with the flat earth. And at first I thought, wow, that is kind of weird. And so she said, I'm not sure I'm a flat earther, but I wouldn't say that I'm convinced we're a circle. And she says, I don't have the time to look any further right now, but I'm certainly not. I mean, when people say flat earthers, I go, it could be that. And so the other way, this person is more deliberate than most, but most of the vaccine skeptics rely for guidance, rely on friends, other people in the community, on how to know how to go down that rabbit hole, what to pay attention to, what to credit. The other way you deal with this kind of overwhelming amount of information, this kind of post-modern world of multiple truth claims, is by being open-minded. And this comes up all over the discourse among conspiracists. Here's a person who says, if someone was to come up to me and be like, I feel very strongly about UFOs, I'd be like, okay, let's hear it. It doesn't mean I necessarily believe you. And then I go and do research or whatever. But yeah, I think it's all about being willing to hear people out. I don't know, we're all just people with our own stories at the end of the day. And so open-mindedness to these conspiracy believers means not being willing to change your mind because you realize you were wrong. Rather, open-mindedness means being willing to accept the possibility that other conspiracy theories are right because they're in the community and because you haven't done the research that they have done. Right? So there's this extraordinarily tolerant, open-ended, open-minded view. Vicky earlier in our conversation talked about the role of temporality, and I think that's fascinating here, that what enables the community to not disagree with one another is in part this idea that I haven't done the research yet, right? I'll go do the research later on. And until that point, I'm fine. We can believe in a flat earth. So open-mindedness means a willingness to allow others to exist in the community. But, and this is to me the really fascinating part, with the hope, with the faith that all these disparate reality claims will mesh in the end. And so vaccine skeptics often talk about people having their hands on different parts of the elephant. And here's one saying, we have all different views of the same multi-dimensional truth. There's a sort of postmodernist line. And the only way we'll understand it in total is if we share with each other. So one, we will understand it in total. And two, we'll rely on this kind of communal relationship. We'll share in order to get to the final truth. And so the imaginary underpinning conspiracists' approach to truth and power is one in which the internet opens up this huge world of knowledge, conflicting, in some ways, incommensurable forms of knowledge. And it's your duty to wade through it to find the truths that work for you. It's kind of a lonely path, but it's made easier by the fact that there are other truth seekers out there with you, people who similarly refuse to be sheep. And their open-mindedness means that they'll support you in your quest, even if they haven't yet done the research to determine that the world is in fact, the earth is in fact flat. So let me wrap up with some very tentative conclusions. I only wrote these a few minutes ago because I was hoping the earlier panels would lead me to some kind of answer. I think that, one, now public communicators say it doesn't just work to give people information. But what I think has come to replace that in part is this idea that encouraging critical thinking will lead people to be sort of more discerning in the media and social media they consume. And I think that what seems to me clear is that populists with conspiratorial beliefs believe they are critical thinkers. Right? again, they call themselves researchers. They see themselves as distinctly unwilling to accept conventional wisdom. So that won't work. What has often been posed as the alternative, and I've written about this more broadly, is that the way we should repair our divisions, whether of partisanship or race or class, the way we can repair our contemporary divisions is by talking to one another, one-on-one, empathetically, sharing our stories, recognizing that there's more that we have in common that divides us. We need to have a conversation. This is often the kind of solution that we hear to political partisan divides in our country. Maybe this would work with right-wing populist conspiracist followers. Maybe intimacy would allow them to actually reassess their beliefs. I'm not convinced that's the case. And I want to just show you one brief quote from a vaccine skeptic who said, "I look at mask wearers as ignorant, and I have to stop myself. I have to tell myself these people are sincere, they believe this, and they are trying to help." And here's another one talking about controversy during the coronavirus and saying, do you believe in the virus or not? There are doctors on both sides. We need to give people the latitude to believe either way and not shame them, blame them, make them wrong. We need to give them the freedom to be where they're at and let that be okay. Now, this is exactly the kind of language that liberals who are proponents of conversation initiatives use. And yet these people were in a meeting planning an anti-lockdown protest. So I'm not convinced that a language of intimacy is necessarily the solution to these kinds of divides. And so I'm left thinking perhaps solidarity across division does not depend on intimacy. Right? What if we try to disengage from this schema of civic repair and begin to see perhaps alternatives? Maybe I'll come to recognize common ground with people across divisions of partisanship, not when we have a one-on-one conversation, but rather when the economy gets better enough that my job feels less precarious and I don't give up my idea that the left wing is trying to ruin the country, but it just is less salient to my daily life. What if we transform the political institutions and the media institutions in which these kinds of conversations go on, rather than insisting that progress, reconciliation, solidarity will only come from intimacy? And then finally, I just throw this out as a possibility that I haven't thought through well at all, but I'm struck by the fact that the anti-vaccine skeptics, QAnon members, other right-wing populists use a variety of metaphors to describe what joins them. Right? So they talk about themselves as social movements, but they also sometimes talk about what they're doing as a game. Right? They also talk about themselves as scientific collaborators. Sometimes they refer to themselves as digital soldiers. And so what I want to leave you with is the possibility that thinking through the metaphors of solidarity that join them, thinking through the multiple social imaginaries that animate their work together might enable us both to better understand them and possibly see if there are other ways of interacting with them other than lecturing them to pay attention to scientific authorities or trying to become their friend through intimate conversation. So let me stop there. I'm looking so forward to your comments and questions and responses.
I'm muted. Hello. Thank you, Francesca, for this fascinating talk. I think it connects to so many issues, as you also already raised in what we've discussed this morning and what we will still discuss in this conference. I'm just thinking about the next panel talking about trust in media and which sources to trust. So I think, yeah, thank you very much for this insightful talk. Before we start the Q&A, I just wanted to remind panelists that you can switch your cameras on now, please. So we will have like a sort of communal discussion. Great, hello. Yes, okay. So for our conversation now, if the panelists, if you want to ask a question to Francesca, please just raise your hand. I think you can do this in your function, in your version of the Zoom, and I will call on you. But also as a reminder for the general audience, so unfortunately you can't have your videos on to ask questions, but please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to write down your questions, and then I will in a little while start to read them out as well. So yes, okay, so with that, yes, so thank you very much, Francesca. I think I will start us off with one question, and then please everyone jump in. So I thought it was really interesting to hear you talk about imaginaries of sharing, and also like the quotes that you gave from the anti-vaxxer milieus. They are really so similar to what I hear from my interlocutors from anti-vaxxer milieus in Germany, but also anti-containment and right-wing populists. So I think there's something in there also that is interesting per se, that like this kind of scientific talking and doing research and whom to trust is very similar across different cultural contexts. But what I wanted to ask now is that, so in my research, I find that people who become mobilized online, so who haven't been mobilized or sort of in groups in offline context, so maybe that's like a little bit different from the anti-vaxxers, that their political engagement is really a singularized one in a sense. So it's like it's not only the practice of like sitting in front of your computer and sort of interacting with sources, but it's also like in a way how they imagine themselves. Like, so even though they talk about sharing things and talking about that the need that more people wake up to certain realities, is like when I watch them, for example, trying to engage in activism, it often fails because it's so like their identity that they're constructing online is based on an individuality that is sort of can't sort of yeah, is not connectable to a groupness in a way that we maybe have seen before. So I just like wanted to ask you, so I find it interesting to think about this from a lens of sharing imaginaries. Is this a paradox somehow? Like, is the internet producing hyper-individualism, but at the same time, imaginaries of sharing, or maybe it's not? Yeah.
I think it's a great question. By the way, Colin, feel free to jump in to anything based on, Colin is here who did the research that I drew on. I am struck by that combination, right? That there's this hyper individualism, right? Do your own research. It's all about finding the truth that's right for you. And yet it's combined with this kind of open-mindedness to other conspiracy theories. Similarly, I'm struck by, you know, oftentimes when popular commentators talk about these right-wing groups, they refer to them as tribal, as if, you know, that's all we need to know, that they're tribal. And I find that really misrepresents them, both in the sense that it makes them seem sort of primitive when their communalism I find distinctly modern, but also it misses the kind of cosmopolitanism that they have. So I too am struck by this combination. I guess in response to your question about whether the people who are just online are different from the people who are online and offline, probably, right? And that's where we go back to the questions that people were wrestling with this morning about the links between, social movements and organizing and what happens online.
Yeah, thank you. So I have 3 questions now from our panelists. So I have Stephanie first, then Savi, and then Tyler. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Professor Polletta. That was really interesting. And thanks, Colin, for sharing your work in this venue. I've learned so much. So my question is about partisanship. And you talked about, the question of whether or not we can consider anti-vax movements as right-wing populists is sort of an open question in and of itself. But and at the end, you were talking about the divisions, right? And partisanship being one of the big ones, obviously today. So what if these communities of shared truths, right, in a multi-truth postmodern society, that's the way we bridge division, right? So, and Anna and I have talked about this a lot with her research in Germany, and the ways in which particularly the anti-vax movements seem to draw from all different sides of the spectrum, particularly Green Party people in Germany. In the US, I find it among people who are radically attuned to climate change, want to live a simpler life, want to live on a small farm and eat their own vegetables until that's their goal. And they also are drawn to these kinds of movements. And so I can almost imagine a future in which these communities of understanding are built, they actually bridge a partisan divide. It's a little bit, it's out there because partisanship is so, drives so much of our division. But I'm just wondering, and maybe Colin can speak to this more in this research, how are people making sense of, the sources they're reading as partisan or not partisan, the people in their communities as partisan or not partisan, and how do people bridge partisan divides within these sort of shared truth environments?
That's a great question. Colin, can you take a crack at that?
Sure, I can briefly take a crack at it. I'm happy to be here. I was not expecting to have to talk, so I'm happy to be able to do so. No, it's great. And that's a great question. And for me, I started this before the 2016 election. And so at the time, I was asking a lot of questions about the upcoming election and Trump and Bernie and Hillary and all of that. And then over the course of continuing to do this, I've noticed a pretty seismic shift in the past years towards the sort of the right-wing populism, as opposed to just this sort of alternative health modalities, which was and continues to be a huge gateway in, but it's sort of blended with this strong sort of libertarian ethos for me. So it seems like, on the one hand, it could be a cause for optimism that maybe there's some partisan divide that we could be bridging. But so far, it seems to me the way it plays out is more along the lines of sort of assembling different ideas from these different sides into this sort of new, post-partisanship where people talk about, which kind of goes right back to populism, sort of putting, us, the people, against the other, against the media, so then it becomes like, the mainstream media is not to be trusted regardless of, the quality or the content or anything. So I think it's an interesting question. There probably is a way to build those bridges, but so far, at least, from what I've seen on the ground, is it hasn't quite manifested. It's more that people are taking some of these alternative health modalities, some of the libertarian stuff, and putting it together in a way that is, at this point, currently more right-wing than left-wing, in terms of repealing Gavin Newsom, which will be happening in November, the vote. That's something that's really fueled through these sort of anti-vaccine, anti-lockdown channels. So in that sense, it's kind of tipped into right-wing partisan lines.
And sorry, has that brought Democrats into it? Did Democrats leave when they found out that it was going really partisan right, or did they just jump on that bandwagon?
It's hard because I haven't found, and this is, there's a great, the Conspirituality podcast that I would totally encourage anyone to check out, that includes a lot of people who more in the alternative health kind of QAnon sort of space that have left and talking about why they left.
Cool.
So it's hard to find, but among the people who I've talked to who are still in there, it's more like I used to be a Hillary supporter and now I wouldn't vote for Biden sort of thing. So people wrestling with who do I vote for? I've only voted Democrat. I don't really want to vote for Trump, but I really don't want to vote for Biden. So maybe should I not vote at all? Should I write someone in? And the people will talk about having come from a liberal background, but sort of evolved past it at this point. So if there are folks that are still, whereas in 2015 and 2016, there were people who were like, yeah, I like Bernie except for the mandatory vaccination stuff. So that seems to have kind of faded away over the past 4 years, for better or worse, probably not for better.
I would argue maybe definitely not for better, insofar as this kind of let 100 flowers bloom, but we can all agree that any established authorities are bad, right? That if the way in which those partisan divisions are overcome is by a kind of rejection of any political authority, I'd say that's bad. But I think it's a great question.
Sadie, please.
Cool. So thanks so much for that talk. It was so fun to hear Francesca's talk and to get a glimpse into Colin's research. So interesting. I have a question that is for both of you, but it's also kind of informed by the earlier panels. So we spent a lot of time talking about people kind of on the far right and conspiracy theorists, but interestingly, a lot of the things that I'm hearing you talk about, like the way that people interact with media, the kind of do your own research ethos, the kind of using community to make sense of really complex information, is something that I found in my interviews, not just with people who are extreme partisans or conspiracy theorists, but also with like kind of apolitical, like quote unquote normal people. And I guess I was wondering, like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you think that there maybe are different dynamics at play? Or do you think that it might be like a variation of extremes? Or I guess, like, how do you see these processes like play out among like the less extreme kind of poles of our kind of political system?
So my route to learning about this was that I had written a book about what I think of as kind of a contemporary schema of civic repair that you see in efforts to combat polarization, that you see in racial dialogues, that you see in public dialogue and deliberation, and in all these kind of civic initiatives that are all aimed at building solidarity. Throughout all of them is that professionals can train people how to communicate with one another intimately in a way that builds solidarity across difference. And so I had seen this as something that's being done among those normal people you referred to, right? Among liberals, among the left. And I thought of right-wing populist groups as being closed-minded, monological, thinking, hostile, tribal. And so then it was really interesting to me to read Colin's data and to find that they're using some of the same language, right? And so I think my argument would be that this schema of sharing, or this imaginary that flows from this practice of sharing, it is shared across the political spectrum, and that it's shaped some of the ways in which populist right groups operate, but I would argue it's pervasive.
All I would add to that is that I feel like it's such a complex issue, and that there are so many factors that sort of are mediating, how we engage with each other and what we find trustworthy, the sources of information we turn to, et cetera. And so I do think it's a very similar process kind of across any sort of political spectrum. But, the metaphors or the sort of values placed on certain kinds of engaging with information, or, what the best way to conceptualize of problem solving, that sort of thing. I think that's different. Like, I'm just thinking about, the Oscars a couple of weeks ago, Tyler Perry got an award for his all of his charity work, and his sort of takeaway message to people was, meet me in the center. That's where we get things done, and that's very different from what goes on in these spaces. So some of those like real anchoring, philosophies about how to create change are different in some of these spaces, and that I think that affects who you look to trust, how you engage with information, et cetera.
Tyler, please.
Thanks so much for this really, really interesting talk. I'm going to ask a question that's similar to Sadie's, but I was trying to listen to what was specific about right-wing movements from your presentation, and kind of what I became attached to was this idea of intimacy, kind of facilitating what we think of as right-wing populist appeals. And I guess I'm curious if that strategy is more kind of ideologically neutral. And so like something that came to mind was the rise of Heather Cox Richardson through social media, this historian who's become kind of a celebrity and generating like a 7-figure annual income from Substack through kind of this kind of personal presentation of her research. And so I think we could all agree she's not a populist, she's not an authoritarian, she's kind of the opposite of those things. And then I was also wondering about what makes your talk specific to the right in terms of the social process of opinion formation. And so, when I think of how I've come to trust vaccines, it's not because I understand what mRNA is or because, I have deep scientific knowledge, but it's because I had personal experience of getting them as a kid and it worked. And I know people who are doctors and they say to trust them. And so I guess, I would just be curious to hear like what specific from your talk, applies only to right-wing movements, if anything.
I think my argument is that a lot of it is not specific to right-wing movements, right? And, I'm struck by the fact that I'm not sure who said this. I don't know if it was Latour or someone else said that, as sociologists, we're used to seeing shadowy forces being responsible for our everyday lives, whether we call those shadowy forces capital or discourse or hegemony. So in some ways, and I think Karin was raising this earlier, that in some ways, what conspiracy theorists do is not too much different from what we do as sociologists. And I think one of the reasons why I love sociologists who are studying these conspiracy groups is that they're aware of that. They're aware of the fact that we often believe things that haven't been empirically demonstrated. And so I wonder, sometimes I think that in fact, one of the problems is that these right-wing groups have such faith in science, right? That they believe that they can find the right answer, and that they believe research really is something that's done individually. When what we know about how science works is that research isn't individual. You are building on what's already known, right? But you have certain techniques, certain conventions for assessing the reliability of the research that's gone before. And so part of me thinks, when I'm thinking of these sort of different metaphors, these different ways of imagining who right-wing populists are as groups, I wonder what would happen if you took a group of them and had them actually meet with scientists, and scientists tell them this is actually the way we do research. It's not this individual process of going down a rabbit hole and questioning everything. There's certain things that we do take for granted, and this is the reason that we take for granted, right?
Yes. So I have now 4 people on my list. It's Peter, Yenna, Catherine, and then Sakshi. So please, Peter.
I'd just like to reiterate that this was a wonderful talk, and it really made me think and rethink about the conversations we just had a couple hours ago. It really is pertinent, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity to hear it. And one thing that I stumbled a lot upon on my research was this idea of open-mindedness and this deflection to the deference almost to open-mindedness. And something I've been thinking about is how it often kind of represents a form of disavowal that creates a gap between belief and behavior. I'll talk to people who say, well, I can't say that I'm certain about this yet, but I have to be open to the possibility. But the way that they act is very indicative of the fact that they are certain about it. I think of people who say, well, I can't be sure that the vaccine is bad, but I'm not going to get the vaccine. So while they say that their beliefs are open, their actions and their behaviors are very, very closed and very, very rigid. And so is this open-mindedness, just a form of disavowal that masks their real intentions? Or how do we treat this kind of holding of contradictory belief and behavior in mind?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And Colin, you can feel free to jump in, but I'm struck by the fact that at least among Colin's vaccine skeptics and other groups, that this open-mindedness extends to people in the community, right? There's this really powerful social dimension to it. And so I'm willing to believe that because that person is in the community and then this temporal aspect. And, I'll do the research for myself later on down the road. So I think you're right that there's this kind of performance of open-mindedness that serves groups well. But how do you challenge that? It's hard to say, you say you're being open-minded, but you're not really open-minded.
Yeah, I found similar sort of thing going on, the dynamic. I like the way you said it about the sort of disavowal, the gap between belief and behavior that, kind of on the ground, talking to people at a conference or something, there are, a plurality of views being expressed and people tabling, and some of which, you might agree with, some of which you don't. And, in talking about, people will say, yeah, I'm open-minded. And then you say, but so how do you feel about this particular, table being represented here or something like that? And it's sort of this, I've been calling it kind of punting, to avoid needing to deal with the potential problems that could result from the group, sort of solidarity of feeling like, yeah, we're all sort of on the same team. And, I don't want to rock the boat too much. That doesn't mean people don't get into very specific debates about do masks work or not work, but there is this sort of overwhelming kind of sense of we're ultimately on the same side fighting these larger forces. So we kind of need all the help we can get. But as a result, I think it does kind of reduce the quality of the discussions and the evidence being discussed, because people are less willing to really get into it, because it's like, well, I haven't looked into that yet. Like you said, it's like totally a thing that happens almost as much as people saying, do your own research. So.
Yeah. Can I ask one question, which, Peter, your question got me thinking about? If there is this gap between what people say and what they do, and, we know that gap is true of all of us, can you imagine a situation in which getting vaccinated against the coronavirus is made easy, is made worthwhile, is made mandatory, and people might just get the vaccine and still be resolutely anti-vaccination? Right? Would there be a way that vaccination behavior could be separated from vaccination beliefs in kind of practical way, if we want to get people vaccinated?
Yeah, I will just briefly say that there are a few people that I talked to who have some conflicts about, for example, whether to leave California after some of the laws went into effect. So, and then other people who, someone serving in the military who is required to get vaccinations. So for them, it was, I'm going to do this thing even though I am still opposed to this. And once I'm done with my service, I won't be getting any more. And I will be doing all of these other, alternative health practices to help combat the effects of the vaccine, et cetera. So yeah, there are, just from my own small vantage point, there are definitely scenarios where people will ultimately choose to get vaccinated, even though they, vehemently oppose it.
Yeah, I had the same, like I was just talking to someone like who is in a right-wing circle, and he has like all these horror, like what happens if you get the vaccine, that there will be things in your body that will be allow the government to control you, sort of. But then he said, like, but if the government decides that I can't travel without this vaccination passport, I will still get the vaccine because I want to travel or something like that. So somehow there's like a sort of flexibility to these to these sort of beliefs that is maybe also
and also
astonishing.
And also that there's a performative aspect to it, right?
Yeah.
So that, and this is when, when I read about QAnon and they have, they believe Democrats are eating babies. And I think what we risk missing is that it's fun to express those beliefs. It's fun to trade those ideas, that it's playing a game. And I wonder if we need to take that more seriously. I'm not sure what the implications of that
are. Yeah. Okay, so I have Jana, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for this informative conversation. I'm learning so much. Just to continue our theme of leader from the first panel to like what you're talking about, it's really, really interesting how this discourse on like mistrust, like QAnon, quote unquote fake news, it's really kind of mirroring the sort of open, discourse that we really emphasize from the liberal side on like grassroots mobilizing, right? Plurality of opinion. People have freedom to personalize their ideas, express them online. People respect each other, and it's really fun, as Francesca you mentioned. It's really fun to engage in this kind of conversation. At the same time, as we've in the first panel showed, these grassroots conversation discourse do have leaders, and that's how the structural changes happen. And so I was wondering, is there sort of the same thing going on the other side? Let's say there are points in throughout the history of right-wing sort of QAnon controversy, these discourse really, there was a turning point in which this discourse turned to violent attack, for example, a Capitol attack on Capitol. And so I was wondering then, is there sort of, how's that turning point? How can we theorize, how can we understand this turning point from discourse to actually taking action? And people who are organizing this, what are they thinking of? It's not really about, I think it's more than plurality. I think it's more than freedom of, respecting others' opinions. I think it also has to do with this, loyalty to individuals, to leaders, especially Trump supporters we see. So I don't know. So I was wondering if they have any insight on just the necessity to look at sort of where, how are these, movements organized, and who are sort of, and what could be fueling this actual acts of violence, and are there, and maybe it has to do with like people, fandom mentality. I don't know. So I was wondering if you have any insight on that kind of aspect.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. That, disciplinarily, these things are often separated. So there are people who study social movements, there are people who study institutional politics, there are people who study fan cultures, and I think we need to get at the links among them. There are people who study social media, and there are people who study mainstream media, and yet we know that the relation between that these movements enjoy their popularity not just because of social media, right? There are deep connections with the mainstream media universe. And so I think we need to take a kind of social movements approach, as you suggest, and look at who's organizing what, right? But at the same time, to think about that blurry area between civic participation and movement participation, that blurry area between fan culture and actual action.
Catherine, please.
Yeah, this kind of ties into the last two questions, but kind of like thinking about these values from like a rhetorical kind of standpoint. So you talked about like these people holding egalitarian values, but then endorsing like authoritarian leaders. Do you think it's like a true endorsement of those values, or do you think it's a kind of a way of justifying like an underlying ideology, like using the idea of like equality and like fairness to justify things that go against those? So like using ideas about like equality and fairness to oppose kind of liberal affirmative action policies and things like that, because some of the work I look at in rhetoric talks about how people appeal to like these larger moral maxims we have in society. The concept of equality is something we all know we're meant to agree with, and we use them to argue for like our more like underlying beliefs? Or is it that these people have a true belief in these egalitarian values and they're being like used to kind of go down these different paths?
I think that's really hard, right? To what extent do people really believe in equality? I think probably empirically, we will find that people are perfectly capable of believing in equality and authoritarianism at the same time, right? That there aren't those neat boundaries. And so that's why I find sort of frustrating a lot of the psychological literature on right-wing populism, which is, as Peter suggested earlier, is kind of all about what psychological types are drawn to this, right? Is it a need for purity? What is it? Are there these basic moral values that they have less of and we have more of, or something? And that it's more interesting, and this goes back to Yenna's point, I think, to understand the networks through which people become exposed to certain ideas, the communities in which people make sense of those ideas. I have been for so long looking for empirical work, ethnographic work, that looks at what people do after they watch a Fox News program or a Sean Hannity story, right? Do they watch that show and think this explains my life? Do they talk with friends? When they're talking with friends, do they bring their own experience into it? Do they bring the experiences of a friend into it? So I think we need a much fuller understanding of how people constitute an I in relation to mainstream media and social media, how those processes work, rather than trying to identify certain features of individuals that make them prone to conspiracy theories or not.
Yes, thank you. I think this also raises an interesting question about methodology that we maybe can return to later. Like, what allows you to be in this spot, to be like watch what people are doing after? Because there's like a difficulty. We talked about this morning also with this maybe methodological difficulty to like see how this validation actually works. So yeah, but first, yeah. Please.
I was just going to say that Chris Bale, maybe he'll talk about this, but he has this fabulous example in his new book where he's reading the online postings of a man that are just vile. And when Chris Bale writes it, he says, you may not want to read the next paragraph. And so I didn't read the next paragraph. Then he interviews the guy. And the guy goes on and on about how he hates the incivility characteristic of online discussion and how he would never treat anyone this way. And so I think as sociologists, we need to know, what do we make of that, right? Is it that these people are somehow disinhibited when they go to online sites? Or is it rather that there are just very different norms for interaction on these sites? And so it's not that a real person is showing their true colors, but rather that we're different people in these different settings. And so that it's the settings that are kind of constituting these psychological characteristics.
Yeah, so interesting. Also to think if there's like a sort of complementation between these two personalities, or if there's sort of like, is it a experimentation in being someone very different somehow, or like, yeah.
Right.
I have Sakshi on my list, please. Hello.
Hi everyone. Hello, Professor Polletta. It was a very enlightening talk. My question is similar to Peter's in some ways. I also wanted to ask you about the distance between belief and behavior. What I was particularly struck by was how the communities you described characterized themselves as digital soldiers, which to me seemed like an almost militaristic commitment to their beliefs. On the other hand, you have something like a DYOR slogan, it seems more open-minded and accepting. So what I wanted to know was that are these communities, or at least some members of these communities, cognizant of this uh, dichotomy? And how do they sort of perceive or navigate this?
Yeah, I'll ask Peter and Colin what they think. At one point, I wrote down all the metaphors that I was seeing of people in right-wing groups describing what they were like, because they often will say, we're like digital soldiers, we're citizen journalists, we're researchers. And so I started to write, and there are tons of them, right? And in the same conversation, probably the same person will use different metaphors to describe what it is that joins them. But I wonder, Peter or Colin, do you see people being self-conscious about the ways in which they describe their solidarity?
Well, I think this was something I addressed a little bit earlier, was that people do hold these kind of disparate understandings of themselves in mind at once. So this was the idea that people see themselves as particularly special. You know, they were chosen to be a part of QAnon because they are a critical thinker. They were very good in school at reading, but also they're the everyman. And anyone could do this, and any person could be involved in QAnon. So they're able to hold these kind of dichotomous conceptions of themselves in mind at once. And one participant who I was talking to kind of justified this when he was talking about vaccine rollout. Actually, he had talked a lot about how he loved the QAnon community because everyone was so, you know, free love and peace and very much appealing to this idea of just a heartwarming community. But when it came to the vaccine, he led me down a line of questioning to demonstrate that the vaccine was actually a cure for all the unwanted people in the US, and how the military was going to be delivering the cure to these people. And in that way, he wiped his hand clean of some of the militancy by putting it onto the authoritative power of the state and him not having to do it. And so they'll often talk about Q being a military intelligence officer. They're saying, well, we support the military, but we ourselves would never do this. Or they'll deflect and say, well, the left has become militaristic. You see what Antifa is doing, so I have no choice but to now become militaristic. So it's often kind of a washing away their hands, yeah.
I would just add that there, in a lot of these spaces, there's so much variation that different ideas come from different people, and as we sort of discussed, are not very often checked in real time. So it's hard because you get this kind of mishmash of ideas coming together, or, you know, sort of attitudes expressed that may be coming from different people, but then you sit down with someone separately and they may say the opposite thing. So, I mean, I think this is something that just as people, we're very good at justifying our thoughts from, you know, in one space, and then kind of like the Chris Bale example. But the variation in the groups is really part of why, like, there's so little that people agree on in some ways. Even if you agree vaccines are bad, you know, the reasons why or what to do about it, there's not as much consensus. So that makes it kind of a rich site, but it's some ways it's hard to pin down, you know, is this how someone feels consistently? Is this how they feel kind of in this moment? And maybe it'll change, but they won't necessarily talk about self-consciously that change taking place. And I think similarly, the self-consciousness or being cognizant of, you know, some of these tricky ideas, kind of weighing disparate beliefs, not talking about it aloud is a great way to let those things evolve without needing to feel like you're being called out, you know? So it's part of the process in some ways is like, it's okay, to kind of give yourself that space that your views can change without you needing to announce to the world that they've changed. I think is a sort of a latitude people extend to each other.
That's really interesting. It also like connects, I think, to a discussion that we had this morning. Also, like this question, like what sort of integration is still necessary when we think about like maybe populism literature that sort of, or old ideas about like a communal frame that is necessary, or like a set of narratives that at least shared. So this like seems, what you're talking about now is, it seems like there's a sort of, there are maybe some communal ideas, like maybe also this anti-elitism in a way, as Francesca suggested before, but there's also like a constant working of like dealing with this disparateness, like of certain people being there or certain groups being there. So I think that's really interesting, like to think that, or if that's like maybe a different kind of group integration in a way or something like that. Yeah, okay. So I think we can maybe start taking questions from the audience as well. So we have a question of Kenneth Moss, who would like to ask his question personally, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you to Dr. Polletta and to the panelists. I'm sorry I came late this morning and I've learned so much already. I guess I wonder maybe to ask a sort of friendly amendment question from an Adornian perspective. I mean, I take the points being made that we need to think really in terms of sort of network and phenomenological formations of people's world building and there's been a lot of emphasis on sort of the shared tendencies across very disparate conspiracy-driven groups, with maybe the only thing binding them together in the panelists telling their sort of anti-elite sensibilities. But so maybe the question would be, are there no striking differences at the level of the how, as Dr. Polletta put it, between expressly racist or white supremacist or nationalist conspiracy groups on the one hand, and sort of those that have a kind of amphibious or underdetermined stance on, say, the composition of society, like the anti-vaxxers. I mean, so that is, once we agree that we can't just assume that there's sort of authoritarian personalities out there looking for the strong leader, fine. But we also, that does seem to be the elephant in the room of this discussion, which may not have been mentioned once. I don't mean this as a rebuke. I just mean it's interesting, is white supremacy and racism. That is, I mean, one way to think about what we're going through right now in the US and globally in different forms, has a lot to do with ultranationalisms, extremisms, exclusionary formations, right? And those seem to flourish in the same settings that you've are all talking about. But a lot of the emphasis in this discussion has been on finding phenomenological and structural and network effect forms that are, to which those differences are irrelevant. And I wonder, is there nothing that distinguishes actual right wing? And maybe we'd also include the incel folks in this, but I don't know. But racist and perhaps misogynist formations, there's nothing that distinguishes how they work and how they draw followers from anti-vaxxers or what have you.
I think that's a great question. I'd love to hear what other people think. I mean, my sense is that there's certainly racism and sexism threaded through a lot of these conspiracy groups, right? It's, what was that famous Sobiari I found that conservative, they interviewed, said that they were most scared of being seen as racist, right? And so of course, these groups there are many groups that are racist and use coded racist language. And so I would imagine that Colin is less likely to hear a debate about some racist topic than a debate about mask wearing or something like that. It's going to be coded. But that said, I think it's a great question to know, how an anti-vaxxer group interfaces with the Proud Boys, right? How that happens. And I wonder if anyone has looked at that.
I was gonna answer to the, yeah, I mean, thank you for the great question. I really resonate with your question. I think that's sort of what I was getting with my question on, like, you know, turning point from like discourse to violence. And then I think that, as you mentioned, we need to, as researchers, make a difference, analytic difference between, you know, sort of quote unquote harmless, you know, anti-vaccine discourse that's more on like respect my opinion as well, versus like outright white supremacist racist discourse. And I think sort of under then and racist discourse. And I don't know if you read, but Shrati, I forgot her first name, wrote a book on revolution that wasn't, where she said that, you know, actually social media is being leveraged by more powerful groups and to strengthen sort of strong ties, like interorganizational ties. And so I was wondering if that's the sort of the like case for this as well, like for right wingers, for people who have power, for people who are sort of fueling this racist discourse, and Trump and other, you know, powerful people, you know, there could be some sort of more structured organization that's fueling this discourse and actually making sort of that sort of violent conversation actually materialize into violent acts in real life. And so I think it's really important to differentiate that. And I also think it's important to sort of understand then, you know, what's a rhetoric, how are people, what's the rhetoric, and when you know, analysis of rhetoric, and when people sort of describe where they're coming from, right? Like, yeah, anti-vaxxers can say, oh, this is my own opinion, I have no, you know, I don't follow anyone, I'm not a follower of anyone. A person with a really anti-supremacist idea can also say that. A person who's a Trump supporter, a person who went to the Capitol, had engaged in Capitol attack, could also say that. But also, like, kind of then going beyond that sort of superficial rhetoric and really understanding sort of you know, who they are affiliated, where they belong to in different spaces. I think it's going to be also necessary for us as researchers.
It's really hard to distinguish the harmless ones from the harmful ones, right? Mm-hmm. And this is precisely the way discourse works, right? So that you'll see that, you know, there was a guy from San Clemente, near where I live, who was at the Capitol, and everyone knew him as this kind of fervent yoga instructor in San Clemente. And so then it turns out that there is this whole sort of yoga movement that's kind of connected to QAnon. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I think that the interesting thing to see the ways in which they're relying on some of the same language, some of the same ideas that they would say, this isn't racist, right? But that still operates on the idea that there is this, you know, we are going to be a minority and we're being taken over and so on.
So I have now Stephanie, then we have a question from Matt Boros from the audience, and then Peter.
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly, I think that this goes to the question of like what makes these online movements right wing and what doesn't. So I think like being recruited into a community of wanting to do your own research and like being an independent researcher and wanting to come to your version of truth, there are people who do that who would then come across even coded racist language and think, oh, this is not for me, and leave. But when you come across a group full of people who've stayed through all of those things, they're okay with that, right? Like we're sort of, you know, we're sampling on the dependent variable here. So that's what makes it right wing. It's a group of people who then, if a Proud Boy enters this group, they're okay with that. Like they're not going to be, you know, there's some people who have, even if they don't have what we were talking about before, like a taken for granted set of truth, they have a taken for granted set of like, oof, that kind of language, that way of speaking makes me really uncomfortable. And there's other people who are like, you know, I'm not racist, but it's okay that this person feels this way, and we'll have that person in their group. And I think that's what makes these groups right wing. It's not just the discourse, that people come to these with prior sets of you know, whether you want to call them take it for granted, but just understanding gut reactions that they will say yes or no to. And I think that that's kind of, you know, I think that part of that also is where partisanship comes into play. Like there are certain things that, you know, if you really are a Republican identifier, if you get into an anti-vax group and they're also really pro-choice, you would have a lot of trouble with that, perhaps, on the other side. But yeah.
Yes, thank you. Matt, can you, are you in our, yes, hello.
Hello. No, thank you very much. This has been a great session. Professor Polletta, at one point you mentioned that some of this combination of intimacy and cosmopolitanism went back to the early days of the internet. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that. I'm particularly curious kind of about what platforms that was on. You know, are we talking Usenet? Because one of my interests is kind of how the different platforms mediate these things differently. So I'd just love to hear more about that. Thank you.
Yeah. Fred Turner has this wonderful book called From the Counterculture to Cyberculture, which is mainly about Stuart Brand, who was the person who first invented the Well, which was the first kind of internet discussion board, and was credited with coining the phrase, information just wants to be free. So he was this real sort of technological utopian who spent a lot of time with this kind of grand, radically democratic vision of a society that would be connected via the internet. The interesting thing that Fred Turner shows is that Brand actually got his ideas about what democracy should look like from his experience in the counterculture, and specifically in Back to the Land communes. So his idea of freedom, equality, democracy was based on this very, tight-knit, quasi-familial group with no rules, in which in fact women did most of the work. Right? And there was a charismatic leader. And so even back then, there was this strange combination of imagining a world free of boundaries, but on the basis of a model of a tight-knit communal patriarchal relationship. Right? So I think this is, again, less about what affordances particular platforms offered, and more what were the kind of cultural ideas that were bound up in the origins and then later in the use of these platforms. There are people who've written really, I think, powerfully about the libertarian kind of bro-ironic culture of early internet, the OOs. And so I would argue that what's interesting is the combination of that idea that information wants to be free, move fast and break things, let's be ironic, with this idea of a kind of band of brothers fighting against the establishment. And that's what we see continuing today.
Interesting, yeah. Peter, did you still want to ask a question, or your hand is lowered now?
I had a quick comment to add to Kenneth.
Comment, yes, okay.
That's all right. I was just going to say, in thinking about Kenneth's discussion of how do we distinguish something like anti-vaxxers from white supremacists and white nationalists, I would say something that I saw frequently is the overlap of those two groups on social media, and the rhetorical appeals are very similar. The day after Trump refused to denounce the Proud Boys at the presidential debate, you had videos of Black Proud Boys members being posted on Twitter, and they're saying, look, you can't be racist. They're Black Proud Boys members. In the same way that anti-vaxxers leverage videos of nurses to say, look, we have this authority here. But I think a difference that I would like to point out is just that when we look at where these white nationalist beliefs come from and how they're embedded into institutions and how they leverage power in their favor to perpetuate and to create the kind of conspiratorial reality that they desire. I think about the infamous line from the Republican strategist Lee Atwater, who says we can't say the N-word anymore. We have to talk about busing. We have to talk about housing. This is how we perpetuate racism within society, is that white nationalists have infiltrated, police departments, and they've leveraged this institutional, structural, historical power to perpetuate kind of their conspiracy theories into reality. And I don't think we see, anti-vaxxers infiltrating science, like scientific journals and hospitals and doing the same exact thing. So I think that when it comes to discourse, it might be very similar discursive appeals, but when it comes to power and history and institutions, I think there's a difference there.
I'll just very quickly say that totally tracks with what I have seen. And I also think, I missed some of the morning panels, so I'm not sure what was discussed, but sort of in white supremacist circles, this sort of, irony, wink and a nudge level of self-awareness about like what they are trying to do in terms of, getting into embedded within law enforcement, for example, how to go and like spread memes that will, affect young white kids versus, in the anti-vax spaces, people do talk about how to get their message out there and how to persuade people, but it is a little less, it's coming from, to me at least, it's coming from a place where people are like genuinely trying to be persuasive to others, especially when they are drawing on their own experience of, convincing a friend to not vaccinate or to delay or something. So they see it as something that, you can maintain a friendship with a person. You can change this one thing about them. It doesn't necessarily require you to like go off the grid or to become, a cop or a 3%er or whatever. And so there's just like, there's a little, to me, a difference about the level of intentionality going on in white supremacist spaces in terms of where they go to recruit and how they recruit people. Whereas I think when we report on anti-vaxxers kind of from a distance, we tend to say, kind of treat it like Russian cyber misinformation, which like that does happen, but it's not really coming from the spaces where, at least the spaces on the ground that I've been hanging out with, like those folks are doing kind of a different thing, more in earnest, not just trying to like spread misinformation, writ large.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Like I in my research, I do a comparison of like milieus, like anti-refugee milieus and anti-containment milieus. And when I was like recently like comparing the interview transcripts, I was also thinking that it's a different affective stance that's maybe offered by the internet. So like a lot of my right-wingers, they talk in terms of like irony and like mocking people, but also of rage somehow. Whilst in this anti-containment mobilization, it's a lot about personal feeling and emotionality on the one hand. So like people making videos of themselves, how they have emotional breakdowns and sort of share this as a truth. So there's like despair side, but then also like they are really somehow more like even more shattered by what they are sort of consuming as news on the internet. So they're really in despair that the catastrophe is imminent or something. So like in a way, this sort of connects to what you were saying, Colin, this like somehow more, I don't know, more earnest or engagement than I've got to know from the right wingers who have like more distance to all of this somehow, or like, yeah. So it's interesting to hear you talk about this.
It's really interesting to think I was thinking about gender when you were saying that, right? So is anti-vaxxers, is that still kind of feminized insofar as it's associated with the health movement? Whereas white supremacist groups are masculinized. I was thinking about Nate Redman's work on preppers, and there are some preppers, they're preparing for Armageddon, and there's some preppers who are all about getting all your supplies in order and having your canned goods and so on. It's kind of feminized. And then there's this masculinized, right? I'm going to get my gun and I'm going to protect my family. And so I think it's interesting to think about how gender threads through these as well.
Yes. So let me maybe take another question from the Q&A chat. So we have one anonymous question. I will read it out. So can you say more about the conclusions you've drawn, how the conclusions you've drawn apply to the American left, broadly construed, thinking of the same kind of self-understanding as critical thinkers, but a similar role of intimacy and community in truth-seeking? For example, Russiagate and other left liberal anxieties that have turned out to be likewise far-fetched. And wondering whether you think there's something peculiar about the right in this moment, or whether the dynamics you're investigating are much broader in its applicability. So I think we already, we discussed some of this, but maybe not as explicitly in relation to to the left.
Yeah,
so,
certainly the left is, we're prone to being wrong. I guess I would say I'm just wary of equating the two, right? When people talk about polarization, I think it's important to recognize that the polarization has been asymmetrical in this country. And that here's where, again, I want to talk not just about people in conversation, but about the structures they inhabit. So the reason polarization is asymmetrical in this country is because our structure of political institutions, because of our media institutions. And so I think that I just would be wary of a kind of false, we're bad on the left and they're bad on the right. Yes, absolutely true. But what's interesting to me is the way in which certain structures promote, or certain imaginaries promote more polarization on one side than the other.
So we have another question from the Q&A from Ardarsh Matthew. Do you want to ask your question or shall I read it? Okay, so I will read it out. So this is concerning this question of open-mindedness we discussed before. How do you contrast that framing with general risk aversion? Something along the lines of, if there is a non-zero possibility that the vaccine can have side effects, or that there is a super elite who have it out against us, isn't it a good defensive conservative move to be skeptical or wait it out, or have that as a default stance?
Is it rational to be wary of a vaccine?
Yeah.
Sure. I think that's where we have to keep being, where we have to always be self-conscious about our own position. But, I haven't researched vaccination safety. I take the vaccine because the authorities tell me to take the vaccine and because I trust Dr. Fauci. So I think, one can argue, is it rational or irrational? I think that's why we perhaps need to talk more about what are the grounds for trust in science, for example, right? Is it I don't trust science and scientists just because I trust everything. And, I keep thinking about big pharma. So I teach a social problems class, and I talk about the role of Purdue Pharma in the opioid crisis. Right. And then I was reading something, a study of conspiracy theorists, and it was talking about how conspiracy theorists believe that big corporations are bad. And I thought, wait a second, that's me, right? That's what I teach. So I would argue that maybe one of the things we need to do on the left or in the mainstream or whatever it is to make clearer what the basis of trust in science, for example, is, and that it's not that we believe everything or should believe everything that scientists say.
Yeah, and I do think that we're starting to see a little bit more of that, which I think is kind of encouraging, in terms of people talking about ways in which the medical establishment has historically screwed up in, either accidentally or intentionally. And so for a while, that knowledge was really being circulated in these spaces. And there were people probably in the general public not as familiar with something like Tuskegee. So now, it's being talked about on like SNL. And I think even though that's probably heightening people's aversion at the moment or kind of tapping into that risk calculus, I think talking about it is going to help cool the temperature over the long run. And the other quick thing I'll say it in terms of the risk aversion and the decision not to vaccinate in these spaces versus taking COVID seriously. One thing that I noticed talking to one person in particular